2022 witnessed severe flooding in Pakistan, extreme drought in Somalia, and heat waves across Europe. The COP27 environmental meeting in Egypt, underway right now, is aimed at speeding up action to prevent more of these climate emergencies. Nations are trying to find a way to meet the targets set out in the Paris Agreement and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. But there appears little discussion about how to deal with the immediate problem of climate migration and people who are searching for safety. Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Philip Hampshire. Wealthy countries have been the main contributors to climate change, yet it's nations in the global south that are facing the brunt of the effects. Sarah Chowdhury reports.
According to a recent United Nations report, wealthy nations need to give up to 10 times the current level of funding to help developing countries adapt to climate change. One of the consequences of the crisis is that currently more than 80% of refugees and internally displaced people come from countries vulnerable to climate change. One of the main issues when discussing climate migration is terminology and whether those fleeing are considered refugees. The term climate refugees was first used in 1985 at a UN Environment Programme. But since then, the UN Human Rights Council found that many people forced from their homes due to the effects of climate change do not fit the definition of refugees. Therefore, they cannot access legal protections. With COP27 already underway, will it be an opportunity for world leaders to recognise that climate refugees are here to stay and come up with lasting solutions?
Joining us directly from the panel at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt is Michelle Yonetani, who's a climate action policy expert at UNHCR, Ines Benomar, who is a researcher in climate diplomacy and risk and resilience at E3G. And in Cambridge in the UK, we have Ayesha Siddiqi, who's an assistant professor in human geography at the University of Cambridge. So first up, Michelle, if I can start with you. What is the aim of COP27? What is going to be decided at this conference and come out of it that hasn't come out of the previous 26 climate conferences that we've had up to this point?
Well, of course, each of these big conferences every year are building on each other, and they've been going on now. Well, this is the 27th one, so nearly for 3 decades. And I think certainly from my side, because I'm here with the UN Refugee Agency, we're really concerned about the communities who are on the front lines of climate impacts already today. And one of the things that we're really hoping for, which is quite exciting, is that for the first time, we have on the official agenda, that means an issue that the negotiators are all going to be together trying to find consensus on, is the issue of financing for what's called loss and damage, or in other words, financing that will really help the most vulnerable countries who are already feeling the impacts of climate change. So these aren't things in the future, but things which are already happening today.
It's important to get these economic transfers sorted out. It's also important to draw all the leaders from around the world together. It focuses attention on climate change and the issues that people face. However, one thing that is not on the agenda this time is climate migration and the potential for climate refugees. Is there any particular reason for that?
Well, it may not be on the official negotiation agenda, but it is actually an issue that's addressed within the UNFCCC, the UN climate change system. So, for example, there is a particular mechanism or a particular group who works specifically on displacement issues and who have developed recommendations to all the parties who are trying to implement those recommendations today on displacement. Displacement as an outcome or a consequence of the impacts of climate change.
Ines, what have you heard going on at the conference so far about displacement and the potential problem of climate refugees?
It's a pretty big topic here at COP27. As Michelle said earlier, there's a lot of talks around loss and damage and reparation for the first time in 30 years. And there's definitely space within those issues as well to sort of link to the issue of climate migration and refugees. As the COP is being held in Africa, and it's the COP that's considered a COP of the vulnerable and an African COP, there's a lot of momentum and emphasis that's also put on issues such as climate migration and climate refugees. There's been many calls from civil society actors as well within the conference center and within the Blue Zone to shed more light on issues such as migration, but also the consequences that those have on human rights as well, and how those are all interlinked to climate migration. So I think it's definitely a topic that's up to date and that's being discussed within the COP, although there should be more space that should be given to it.
When we're looking at the issue, Ayesha, of climate migration, if we take the word migrants, there are plenty of modifiers that get attached to the word migrants, whether it's economic migrants, whether it's conflict migrants, whether it's illegal migrants. Climate migrants, though, are there any climate migrants at the moment, or is it more of a hypothetical thing people are expecting to come through in the future?
I think that's a really relevant question because we do hear these terms like climate migrant, climate refugee being bandied about quite a lot. And I think particularly because I come from an academic background and we want to look at what research is showing us. Within scholarship, we're quite critical of terms like climate migrant and climate refugee because research has repeatedly shown us that nobody migrates only because of climate, only because the climate has changed, or only because the rains were harder this year. It's always because of the impacts that those things have. And so obviously they get much more interlinked with people's livelihoods, with people's economic opportunities. And when those things are affected, that's when people make difficult type decisions to move. And even there, research has shown that people generally tend to move close to home rather than make long and expensive journeys to Western parts of the world. So I think a little bit of nuance and depth in understanding this is important, even though I recognize that perhaps when talking about this, it's a kind of shorthand or a short form that's used, a climate migrant, but actually we should be careful in use of such terms.
Michelle, I saw you nodding there. Are there any groups that you would consider at the moment to already be climate migrants? Or is it more of a theoretical thing that people are saying, well, 5 years out, 10 years out, this is something we've got to look for?
The reality is that the different impacts of climate, which are many and diverse, whether that's changing rainfall patterns, so too much water happening unpredictably, with greater intensity than ever before, causing floods, or too little rainfall, causing drought, for example. All these types of impacts then have other impacts, like the previous speaker was saying, on livelihoods and so on. So you can say already that the fingerprint of climate change can be seen on some of these more extreme weather events. So climate change, in fact, is influencing those movements. It is having an impact, but it's not acting alone.
The opening statement that we had come through at COP27 was provided by US Vice President, former US Vice President Al Gore. We have a clip of him here. Let's have a listen to what he actually said.
Experts are predicting as many as 1 billion climate migrants crossing international borders in the balance of this century. Think of the millions that are crossing borders now and the xenophobia and authoritarian populism that is caused by a large surge of refugees. And then imagine, if you will, what 1 billion climate refugees would do. It would end the possibilities of self-governance.
Ayesha, I get the impression that you think that might be a little bit alarmist. It certainly does seem like very alarmist language. Is that your take on it or not?
Yes. So I do want to kind of caution against these kinds of very alarmist, very securitized ways of thinking about we need to be really careful that billions of people, particularly from global South countries, are going to be rocking up on our shores. And I think, whereas I understand that what Al Gore is trying to say is that it's going to have an impact on the way that particular far right groups, etc., might be strengthened. I think he's feeding into that narrative, because billions of people are not really going to be rocking up on other continents and in faraway places. Repeatedly, what research on climate related and climate connected movement has shown us is that people tend to move within their countries, or potentially cross a border into a neighboring country. But the idea that this is going to result in lots of people from global South countries making very long and very expensive journeys to Europe or to other parts of the world, there's just no evidence to support that millions or billions of people are going to be doing that. This is just unfortunately feeding into very, very alarmist rhetoric.
So you think this is, if you like, a little bit of hyperbole, a little bit shrill, as it were?
Yes, and actually very damagingly so, because then when there is a political agenda that mobilizes this, those are exactly the kinds of images it shows. Lots of men from particular parts of the world who are kind of flocking into Western borders because their countries are no longer habitable or whatever, and then that generates more hysteria, more anti-migration kind of. It's just a very, very dangerous game to play. And I don't think anyone really should be fueling these fires.
Ines, how do you feel about it?
I strongly agree with what Ayesha was saying. Climate change is definitely acting upon these migration scales and patterns, in the sense that there are impacts right now in vulnerable communities, whether it is in small islands, developing states, or in other countries in the global south that are dealing with water scarcity, with drought, with all these issues that can lead people to want to make the decision of changing environments because their livelihoods are being affected where they are and where they've been for their whole lives. But that doesn't mean that the trip to very far away places that is often very expensive is going to be the first decision that's going to be made. So I strongly support what she was saying, in the sense that there has to be nuance over all of this, and that this alarmist sort of narrative shouldn't really be fed or like bought into, because then it can really feed into what we're seeing in global north and industrialized countries, across governments and across the media and across electoral campaigns, of having billions of people coming, and now with the impacts of climate change, that becoming worse in the upcoming years. Now, I'm not saying it's not something that's not going to happen, that people are not changing their patterns of living and their migration patterns because of climate change issues, but there has to be nuance in how you approach the issue, because it's not black or white.
No, but
often...
if I can just bring in, we have a clip here from Philip Davis, who's the Prime Minister of the Bahamas, who's also been speaking at the COP27 conference.
I'm asking, what is it worth to you to prevent millions of climate refugees from turning into tens of millions and then hundreds of millions, putting pressure on borders and security and political systems across the world?
Michelle, both the other guests feel that these warnings are a little bit alarmist. What do you think? That's now two voices out of the same conference who are both saying the same thing. Does it feed into far right-wing narratives and fears, or is it a reasonable expectation of the future?
I basically agree with the other two speakers. What the language does do is underline the urgency of the situation. The world is in a climate crisis, and the people who are really being affected already today and who will be most affected in the future are those who are living in poverty, those who don't have access to protection from the kind of changes in their environment, whose livelihoods are being eroded every day. That's where the focus should be. I think the emphasis on these numbers and on that particular rhetoric, as well intentioned as it may be, in emphasizing the climate as a crisis situation that we are not responding fast enough to. At the same time, it's deflecting from where we should be focusing, which is on actually strengthening the resilience of the people who are really living already in very vulnerable situations. If we just talk about refugees, for example, and I'm talking about people who've been displaced from one country to another due to conflict or persecution, 70% of refugees that the UNHCR works with are coming from some of the most climate vulnerable countries in the world. And 9 out of 10 refugees who actually returned to their countries just in the last year are going back into situations where even if peace has been reestablished, they're still highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate shocks. So all of these things sort of link together. We should be focusing, though, on really protecting and building the resilience of people who may be displaced in future and who are already experiencing its impacts today.
Ines, I saw you nodding there. You agree with that assessment?
I agree. I think one thing that the COP27 can do, and that really has a point in, is really bold climate action investments right now. So whether that is shifting finance into mitigation and adaptation so that communities on the ground don't have to get to the point of reaching adaptation limits or maladapting and then having to make the decision of leaving your home as a loss and damage consequence can come, or as a consequence because of climate impact, and as a way to deal with maladapting or reaching that limit of adaptation. So what the COP can do is to really have that bold space and climate action commitments come out of COP27 this year, and building up on the Glasgow Climate Pact that came across last year in Glasgow. And so giving space to that and equipping communities on the ground with the tools so that they can deal with these impacts on a day-to-day basis.
So, Ayesha, if we can all agree that those warnings are a little bit over the top or a little bit excessive, you are a professor of human geography. Do we have any kinds of numbers or estimates or forecasts for the kinds of things that we are expecting here?
I think in some ways I would like to, particularly because I too focus on global South and on understanding kind of post-colonial and non-Western societies and their knowledge systems, etc. I'd like to kind of suggest something slightly different to numbers, and that is that in kind of keeping the entire debate around what do we need to do to stop the migration of climate affected people from happening, we end up facilitating that discussion of kind of higher border walls and better and stronger anti-immigration policies and things like that. So effectively, what you're doing is you're just trying to keep people who are suffering the most and who are most affected by things like sea level rise, drought, difficult living conditions, from like falling deeper and deeper and deeper into levels of uninhabitability and unlivability, right? So then we're really saying we don't care as long as they're suffering out there, as long as they don't come here. Whereas I think that whole conversation needs a little bit of shift. It shouldn't be about how many millions will come here to the west or will move to the north. It should be about how people living there, which is kind of what Ines was saying, are better supported and are better provided the resources that they need so that they don't fall into those very depths of unlivability that they're kind of trying to tackle and negotiate right now.
Or are taken advantage of, I presume, as they undergo these very difficult transitions that are taking place. Ines, what kinds of things would you expect to come out of the COP27 conference that might assist in this? What kinds of solutions might be discussed?
I'm definitely expecting to see more emphasis on the whole adaptation debate and the extent to which it touches upon vulnerable communities, and really getting some commitments and timelines in place, whether that's for topics that have been agreed upon in Glasgow last year, such as the Global Goal on Adaptation, which aims to help communities on the ground. On top of that, I'm really hoping to see an outcome on loss and damage financing. I think that really is one of the 3 points that is being discussed at this COP that really links with the debate that we're having right now. And so increased bilateral finance for loss and damage and the support of a multilateral loss and damage finance fund to be fully operational by 2024. I think having timelines in place agreed at this COP on this will be crucial to help communities that are suffering of climate impacts right now around the world. And as I said earlier, we don't have time to waste. Time is of the essence, and we don't have the privilege of that anymore. So I'm really hoping to see this come out of COP27 this year.
Michelle, what are you hoping to see come out of COP27 this year in terms of solutions or potential avenues of discussion, as it were, for what to do with migration and climate change?
I think that this whole loss and damage debate that we're discussing, I think this is indeed a really key area for where we can actually act today to avoid displacement happening in the future. This is something that needs more focus, even if the discussion about it has actually come up on the agenda much more than ever before. Perhaps an area that I would say that we can build on further is actually the inclusion of the voices of people who've been displaced themselves. Perhaps when we're in these big conferences, there's a lot of very technical talk happening. And outside the gates, we hear civil society activists, people who are living in countries on the front lines of all these impacts today, really shouting for more support. I would like to see perhaps in future that as their voices are getting more recognized, they're also included much more in the actual discussions and in finding the solutions. We cannot find all the solutions in the conference, but we can certainly create the environment for those things to be found at the local level with the leadership of the communities themselves.
Now, Ayesha, I would like at this point to pick up on some comments that you made earlier about the potential for migration, not necessarily across national borders, but within countries themselves. Now, which countries do you see having, if you like, both of those two different sets of problems?
So in most of the kind of global south countries that I have worked in, I've done work on flooding in Pakistan, on typhoons in the Philippines, on flooding in Colombia and Peru in South America. And in most of these places, you do have people who are being told that they can't live in particular areas because those areas are in vulnerable zones or in places where hazards are likely to occur, and they're being asked to move, or they've been forced to move because of the environmental circumstances. And these communities tend to find places near or around where they live, because people want to be in the same kind of cultural, economic context that they're familiar with. No one really wants to make a very, very long and expensive journey elsewhere.
Moving to higher ground, as it were, or moving to less drought-prone areas in a country that isn't prone to flooding.
Yes, exactly. And in, for example, in the work that I did on rising sea level or rising waters because of coastal erosion, etc., in Pakistan, the people who traditionally lived in those areas and then were forced to relocate and move inland and completely change their patterns of livelihood, across the board, across all the districts I worked in, they were the poorest because it was so recent. Their kind of move inland, their change in livelihood, their change in living, in the way that they were living, their cultural patterns, etc. That clearly this kind of rising water had clearly had a material and economic impact on their lives.
Ines, how can some of the countries that aren't quite so affected by climate change respond to this? What kinds of things can they look to do to assist nations like the island nation of Tuvalu, which is obviously very at risk of potentially disappearing or flooding.
I think some more concrete steps that can be made by industrialized countries that can help small islands, developing states, include really emphasis on financing and going across issues such as accessibility and eligibility to those funds. I think for countries that are suffering from climate impacts and communities on the ground, it's incredibly hard to access climate finance that are held in multilateral development banks or that are held in development budgets of certain countries. So ensuring that these eligibility criteria and accessibility issues are made easier to deal with for communities on the ground, and that the financing reaches those communities quickly, because it takes up to 5 years for a community that has been dealing with a climate impact to actually have the financing to then implement actions to deal with that. So what do you do between those 5 years, right? So trying to make those timeframes shorter and getting rid of the bureaucratic sort of red tape that's often referred to in adaptation finance, for example, is one thing that countries of the global north and like donor countries could do to help communities suffering from this underground.
Michelle Yonetani, Ines Benomar, Ayesha Siddiqi, thank you very much for joining me and agreeing to talk about this very difficult and trying issue. Thank you for your time today. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. If you head online and search for Roundtable, TRT World, or look for us on YouTube. But for now, from me and from all of the team here, goodbye, and thank you for watching.